Greetings, welcome back to the channel, and today we are talking all about lenses. The lenses that go on our camera. Today we're going to understand what the lenses are, how do they work, what are these different rings, what are this abomination of this bamboozle shit, and also how to choose the perfect lens for your work. And we're also of course going to understand all these different numbers that are written on a lens, which are very cryptic to first look at. But yeah, let's get started. So first things first, by the way, if you have not watched the video of the Noob's Guide for a Camera before watching the Noob's Guide for a Lens, you should definitely go back and watch it. But we're going to start off talking about lenses. So first things first is, what is a lens, right? So if you remember physics, like in 10th or 9th physics, or if you have studied physics in 11th or 12th, you remember from optics, there is something called lenses, which are basically a piece of glass, right? Any piece of glass can be a lens, which is used to manipulate the direction of light that is falling onto the glass. So in most cases, if you're taking a photo, some light rays are falling onto a glass lens and they are curved towards a particular point. So if two parallel rays hit the lens and they converge at one point after going through the lens, that is called the epicenter. Now this epicenter is very important, I'll tell you why. So this is the lens, right? And here we will have the camera body. So let's bring a diagram of that. This is the camera body, suppose, and this is the sensor, right? This is the sensor and this is our lens right over here. So here basically we have the actual lens. Now again, two parallel rays are falling. We generally want to have the sensor at the point where these two rays converge, because that is where the focus is created, and that is also called the focal point of the lens, and that is exactly why this distance is also known as the focal. If you remember anything about physics, you know that this is called the focal length because that is the focus point, the focal point of that particular lens. And what does focal length do? Let's try to understand that. So let's talk about focal length. So in everything we'll go try to understand like where are these things written on the lens. So in this particular lens, you'll see right over here it's written 28 mm to 200 mm. This means this has a focal length. This has a variable focal length of 28 mm to 200 mm. Like right now it is at 28. Like here you can see it is currently at 28. But if I rotate this way, I can increase the focal length all the way to 200. Right? What does it mean? I'll come to that later. But you can see every lens has this written somewhere over here. Like this one has FE 1.8/50. This 50 is 50 millimeters. That is basically the distance between the sensor of the camera and the glass of the lens, right? Now, let's try to understand a few relations between different things about how our image is captured and with the focal length. So I'll write focal length as FL for this particular case. It's not referred to as FL. So as focal length increases, your zoom increases, right? As focal length increases, your field of view, pardon my handwriting, decreases. And it's very easy to understand, honestly. So suppose this is the sensor. Okay, this is the sensor and we have a lens right over here. Okay, this suppose this is 50 mm. Now you see how wide this lens can actually work. This much, right? This, if I extend this line, any light that is coming from inside these boundaries will end up in the image that we create on the sensor, because this light will fall on the sensor and we will have an image. But on that same sensor, we have the lens much further, maybe at 200 mm. So with a higher focal length, now you see, if I draw that same diagram, the field of view is much lesser. Only the light that is inside of this particular path will get feeded onto the sensor. It will fall onto the sensor and will create an image. So basically you understand, the lower the focal length, the greater is the field of view and the lesser is the zoom. And zoom is basically that key, if I'm only focusing this much of image data, this much of area onto that sensor, it will be much more zoomed in. It's very self-explanatory. So we understand what focal lengths are and what they mean, what they exactly mean for our images. Here is an example of 16 mm focal length. Here is an example of 24 mm. Here is an example of 50. Here is an example of 28. Here is an example of 75. Here is an example of 100. And here is an example of 200. So moving from focal length, the next thing that we need to talk about is the aperture. Aperture, as the name suggests, is basically the opening of the lens. I'll try to show you the opening of some lens. Yeah, small black hole at the end of the lens. That is the aperture. So very obviously, the bigger the aperture, the more the light comes in and the brighter our image gets. So generally when shooting in low light conditions at night, especially when there is not much light to work with, you will want to work with a bigger aperture lens. So how exactly do we signify the aperture, right? How do we know what aperture this lens has? This is written as something called f-stop values, right? You will see the lenses with f1.8 written and f2, then f2.8. Something will probably have f3.6 or something like that. Also have f1.4, and these values can be anything. Honestly, these values can be anything. So I'll again talk about the correlations. As these AF values go up, okay, the light or the brightness goes down. As the f value goes up, the background blur also goes down. So the bigger the aperture is, the more light comes in, the more the information comes in, and we get better background blur, which is also called as shallow depth of field or also called as bokeh. So if you're shooting inside a small room but you still want some background blur on it, you need very low f-stop value, something like f2 or even lower. Like this one has an f, as you can see over here, f1.8, right? You can see this particular lens that you have on this camera right now is f1.4. That is why you see when my hand is in focus, my face is completely out of focus. That's how shallow this depth of field is. Fine. Okay, we understand what aperture is and how to deal with that. Next, we have to talk about a few properties of the lens. Few properties are things like, okay, let's go with a few physical properties first. Something like the rings, right? Most lenses have at least one ring. Some lenses have two rings, and they might also have some buttons. So let's talk about this one first. Okay, this has one ring. As you can see, this is a f1.8, which is the aperture, and 50 mm lens. So it just has one value, 50 mm. This means there is no zoom in it. It is a fixed focal length lens. So this ring actually just helps us shift focus from front to back. So this ring just actually helps us focus from front to back. It helps us shift focus from the foreground, midground, background, and all of that. But in case we have a lens like this, which is a variable zoom lens or a variable focal length lens, we have another ring which controls the zoom. So as I explained in the focal length part, now it is currently at 28 mm, right? So the distance is actually 28 mm. And if I want to increase it to 200, that is why the lens gets longer, the glass is pushed much more forward, and now the distance is much more. So that is the main use of the rings. Then there is also, you will often see buttons of manual focus and autofocus. So manual focus is very simple. You rotate the ring to shift focus and particularly focus on one point. How autofocus works is something very different. So we get an image on the sensor. That image is sent to some program inside the camera body that is trying to identify where faces are, where eyes are, and where the most important thing inside the frame is. It generally works with faces or the most contrasty part of the image, and that program figures out faces or eyes. Like most autofocus sensors generally look for eyes in the frame and they focus on that, and then that data is fed onto the lens, and these lenses actually have motors, physical motors inside of them, which shift the focus, this ring is how we shift the focus from the outside. They can shift the focus from the inside as well, and you will often see these kind of lenses adjusting a little bit, like front back when they are trying to adjust the focus. So that is how autofocus works, but you don't really need to understand all of that. Just understand that in autofocus, the focus follows you around. It follows the most prominent thing inside the frame. So how good or how accurate the autofocus is a property of the camera body, not of the lens. But how fast and how smooth the autofocus is a property of the lens. So you should really do a lot of research on different forums and on the internet before buying these things. Alright, next thing we need to worry about is the lens mount. So this is what a camera sensor looks like, and the lens mount, which is this thing, basically docks onto a camera sensor. If you have watched Interstellar, you know what docking means. It basically docks onto the camera sensor, and then you don't have to worry about it falling out of the camera and everything. So different companies, different brands of camera have different mounts, and even inside one brand they might have different types of mounts. So whenever you're buying a lens, first things to look at is the mount, especially if you're using some third-party lens. Like I'm using a Sony camera, but this lens is from Tamron, so I need to look at this thing. It says Sony E mount. That is the mount on my camera, and that is why every lens I buy has to have the Sony E mount for it to work with the camera. So I think that is all the things a beginner needs to know about camera lenses. You will have a much better idea after this video about which lens to buy, and not just buy the kit lens, as I said in the last video. If you have not checked out the Noob's Guide to Camera, here is a link, go check it out. And if you want a Noob's Guide to Filters, because like, what is this abomination of a thing? What is a ND filter? What is a Pro Mist filter? What is a polarizer? What is a UV filter? What are these things? Why are they used? And how to use them? How to buy the best filter? If you want a Noob's Guide to lens filters, let me know in the comments below, and I'll make it as soon as possible. I hope you learned something new from this video. I'll see you in the next one.